I like to joke that I've written 12 books, of which one sold 1.5 million copies, and the other 11 sold about 12 copies each. It's not quite true, but it is true that that book, The First 90 Days, really struck a nerve for many people. It's now gone into its second edition, and I'm thinking it's probably ready to be refreshed yet again because so much is changing. But at the same time, a lot is still very much staying the same around taking charge in new leadership roles. And so just a little bit on sort of my personal history with this and how I got interested in the subject and where that interest has gone over time. So back in the late 90s, I was in my late teens at the time. Kidding. I got interested in the subject because I realized I was teaching about organizational change and leadership, that there was really almost nothing out there about the challenge of taking charge in a new role. And that's a really challenging time for reasons we'll talk about. You're struggling your way up the learning curve, and at the same time, you're being asked to have an impact on an organization. And, there's lots of books about leadership, there's lots of books about change, but there was really nothing that sort of focused laser-like on that moment, right? That moment when you get that new job and you begin to need to have an impact. And so that's how I sort of got interested in it. My personal practice now is working mostly, almost exclusively with CEOs taking new jobs. That can be an internal promotion, right? Someone who's come up through the organization, become the CFO, COO, and is promoted to being the CEO. Or it can be an external hire, right? Often those are folks who have been CEOs previously, that's usually the case, but they may be moving up to a larger organization, a more complex organization, a different institutional and governance structure, and so on. What this means is I get a pretty unique vantage point to watch and support people taking charge in very senior roles. And that keeps me interested and also keeps me aware of what's really going on out there and some of the challenges. And when Britt and I do our session a little later, we're going to talk a little bit about what some of the big leadership challenges are that CEOs and COOs like her are facing. So working with very senior executives. You don't do much of that work before you're talking with them about their teams. So Martin, you were gracious enough to bring up the subject of teams, but teams and transitions very much operate together. You know this, when you take a new job, you don't get to build your team, usually. What you usually get to do is inherit somebody else's team, and then you need to assess that team and reshape that team to be what you need it to be. So it was very natural for me to move from focusing on leadership transitions to focusing on teams in transition and the reshaping of teams. As Klaus indicated, you'll get the slides from the presentation, but I'm also going to send you a few HBR articles that are additional resources around particular subjects. And one of those is a 2016 article I wrote called Leading the Team You Inherit. Because again, there was very little out there about how to do that, and it's hard, right? Because you don't get to lead your team from scratch. Now, of course, once you're working with senior executives and you're working with their teams, pretty quickly you're into transformation. Every leader, I think these days, is leading change, right? You're not given a new job today and told everything's fine, don't worry, take your time, get comfortable. That doesn't happen, right? What happens is expectations are immediately very high on you to do something with the organization to improve its performance, extend its impact, deepen its innovation. And so leadership and transformation, I think these days have become very connected to each other. And so that's been the sort of final part of my journey, which is getting more and more involved personally in helping CEOs and their teams lead large-scale organizational transformation. And again, some of the resources I'll send to you are things about how to think about doing that effectively. What are some common mistakes that people make in trying to lead organizational transformation? And if we get some time, we can touch on that a little bit. So, I want you to reflect briefly on how many jobs you've had so far in your career. And you can use your fingers of both hands if you want to do that. The reason I say this to you is when I look at the careers of leaders, I see a whole series of different types of transitions going on. And you might reflect a little bit on how often you take new jobs. One of our oldest clients is Johnson & Johnson. It's a global healthcare company. I started working with J&J in about the 2000 range and do transition programs with VPs there still today. And the average VP is in Johnson & Johnson today is in their job for about 2.5 years. I want you to think about what that means, okay? At the individual level, it means every 2.5 years, you take a new job, you work your way up the learning curve, and at precisely the moment you become competent, you do it all over again, right? And at the level of the organization, it means something like 40% of the people at that level are taking new jobs every year. That's a tremendous amount of churn, right? It has a very big impact. And so I'd invite you to reflect not just on your own experience of transition, but how much transition is going on in your organization today, and what's the impact of that? Because the ideas that are given in the first 90 days are certainly applicable when you take a new role, but they're also applicable when you have someone who reports to you taking a new role, or a new boss taking a new role, or a new peer who's taking a new role. And so I get very interested in what's the overall impact of transition on organizations, and what's the result if you're able to accelerate everybody taking new roles. Just going to do a quick test and to see. We've run this experiment now twice before, Klaus, and it's worked once and it didn't work the other time, so we'll see what happens this morning. How many of you personally are 6 months or less in your current jobs? Got it. So maybe 20%, a little less. How many of you have someone you report to, a manager or boss, who is 6 months or less in their current jobs? Hands up. Yeah, a few. How many of you have a peer on a leadership team of which you are a part who is 6 months or less in their current jobs? Hands up. How many of you have one or more people reporting to you, directly or indirectly, who's 6 months or less in their current jobs? Any questions? Right? I'm kidding, right? My point is very simple, right? Which is, even if you're personally not in transition, you're being impacted by somebody's transition, often multiple people's transition. So transition is very present in organizations, especially these days, and has a big systemic impact. And so it was very natural for me to move from focusing on helping you as an individual successfully get up to speed in a new role, to helping organizations help all their leaders get up to speed in new roles. Because the impact of doing so, of putting in place a common language, Martin, a common framework, is really huge when applied across the entire organization. And that's a big part of the work I do today. Also, and again, keep in mind, there's a lot of variability here, but what the research shows is that for executives, it takes on average 6 months to become fully effective in the role. That's not 6 months to transition, right? It's 6 months to become fully effective in the role. Of course, there's huge variability. You're coming into a crisis or a turnaround, you may be having an impact and coming up to speed very quickly. You've been hired from the outside into a successful company, it may take a lot longer before you're really having an impact. So 6 months is an average, but there's lots of variation. And also what you find is that each transition impacts a lot of other people, right? And the research we've done on this suggests that the number's in around 10 to 12. Every leader in transition has some impact on 10 to 12 other people in the organization. So hopefully the point is clear, right? And I'm going to get you to think a little bit about it. As you step back and look at your organizations and think about the impact of transition, what would the benefit be of taking a methodology like this and beginning to accelerate everyone in the organization? That statistic at the bottom, by the way, I think is sobering, although I should say that as organizations have gotten better at onboarding, the failure rates have declined. And it's actually not just onboarding. I think organizations have got better at recruiting. So, recruiting and onboarding obviously are tightly linked to each other. But the failure rates are still high, especially in organizations with strong cultures and a lot of people who have been around for a long time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So good. Hopefully I don't need to make too strong a case that there's a lot of benefit in helping people make successful transitions into new roles, because the research about this is absolutely solid, right? If you do the right things, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, what those right things are, you're going to dramatically accelerate the time that people take to get up to speed in the roles. You're going to reduce rates of derailment. Perhaps a little less obvious, you're going to increase engagement and retention, because if you bring people into the organization or you support them in taking a higher level role, it's pretty natural that they're going to be feeling a little bit more connected to the organization. And then the final point is that if you are putting people in charge of significant organizations, you're making pretty big bets in the end. And these days I see organizations making bigger and bigger bets on talent, pushing people further and faster than they have in the past. And so in the end, supporting those transitions, I think, has an element of risk management or risk mitigation that goes along with it. This was a study we did a couple of years ago with Egon Zehnder, a whole lot of senior leaders taking new roles. Some got support, some didn't. And we went back and talked to them, obviously, but also to their HR business partners and the people they report to. And, getting up to speed in half the time that they otherwise would have, on average, is a pretty significant impact, right? So there's no doubt, okay, I can say this definitively, there's no doubt that there's huge benefit to supporting people in making transitions. And that's true, by the way, not just of coming in from the outside, it's also true of making significant internal moves. So why don't more organizations do that? There's a few reasons. One is sink or swim culture, right? I sometimes describe this as leadership development through Darwinian evolution, right? Or as we have suffered, so shall ye, right? There's a notion that, look, you're a leader. You know the organization. Lead, right? If you don't make it, we're probably better off without you. It's that kind of ethos that does it. So that's one factor. I think another factor is that it's sometimes not clear whose responsibility it is to make it happen, right? Who is it in the organization, or what sets of people in the organization really are responsible for helping to speed up those transitions? Is it the hiring manager? Is it HR? Is it learning and development? Is it talent acquisition in the case of people coming in from the outside? It's often not at all clear who owns the responsibility for doing that. And we'll talk more about that as we go forward. So why focus on transitions? Hopefully it's obvious that when you take a new job, there's a lot at stake in what happens in those first few weeks and months. That what you do during that time has a very big impact. Why? Because we're people. And people and the way we think tends to reach judgments fairly quickly about others. Often it begins within seconds of meeting somebody. And once we've made judgments, we don't tend to change our minds very easily. And so if you're successful in building credibility early on, that tends to propel you forward. But if you make early mistakes, you can get yourself in a situation where it can be very, very difficult to recover. Occasionally, fortunately not very often, I get asked to do what I think of as rescue missions. So I had an example recently. Global technology company had hired a very senior executive from an Indian technology company. And after 6 months, it was pretty clear that person was derailing. They had a very hierarchical, very command and control, very micromanaging, very scolding leadership style. They'd alienated their team, they'd alienated their peers, even though they were a tremendously accomplished person. And so they asked if I would try to help. And I couldn't help because so much damage had been done. People's opinions had hardened to the degree that there was really nothing this person could do. Even if they could make the changes, which they were willing to try to do, the system no longer was going to accept them. And this is why it's so critical in the end to make successful transitions. I really like the quote, I'm sure you've heard it before, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, right? Will Rogers. The reality is you don't even get a first chance to make a first impression because you have a reputation coming into the job, right? If you're internal, people know you or they think they know you, right? But they know you in the context of specific roles, and you may be a different person to a degree as you move into a different role, and you've got to struggle with that. But even if you're coming in from the outside, right, people will have made calls to the people who think they know you. And so understanding your reputation, thinking about your own leadership brand, and how you want to work with that coming into a new role is really pretty critical. We love it when we get to work with people before they actually take the job. That critical period of time before you're, between accepting the role and really being in the role. And hopefully that's time when you actually get a little bit of time to think. And it's not a time when you're consumed finishing up your old role, right? Or going on vacation to Mauritius or whatever it is you feel like you want to do. Because there's a period of time when you can really accelerate your ability to have an impact. Because as you know well, as soon as you're into the job, you're into the swirl, right? The meetings, the deadlines, it's often very hard to take a step back and really do a good job of planning. And so I love it personally when I'm working with someone who's coming into a CEO role, and we can talk about how are they planning to arrive in that organization. What's the messaging they want to convey? How are they going to start to engage? What's their stakeholder engagement plan going to look like for the first day, week, month, and so on? So that, if you have an opportunity to do it, to think it through, to begin to get yourself up the learning curve is really tremendously valuable. Of course, sometimes you just don't. Sometimes you're just put in the job and that's, simply the way it is. Even worse, sometimes you're doing two jobs, right? You're finishing up one job even as you're trying to get up to speed on a new one, which is terrible, in my opinion. Bottom line, transitions are critical times. They're times that you really need to think about how you're going to begin to shape impressions, build credibility, begin to engage with the organization in a constructive way. I've come to believe that a lot of it's about momentum, right? Positive and negative. If you're successful, if you think about the right-hand side here and you work from the bottom up, you build the right relationships, you engage in the right learning, you get some early wins, you build credibility, it becomes a self-reinforcing positive cycle. If you look at the left-hand side and start at the top, you don't do a good job of learning about the organization, you don't build the right relationships, you make some early mistakes, you generate some resistance, you lose credibility, you don't get support, and the cycle can be very much self-reinforcing. You've all seen this. I know you have, right? I know you've all seen people who made some early mistakes and then really struggled. And that, obviously, we don't want to have happen. So good. So just to break things up a little bit, I'm going to get you to spend a little bit of time at your tables. And here's the two questions I want you to focus on. Question number one, what's the most challenging transitions you've made into new jobs so far in your career, and what made them challenging? And the second question is, how good a job does your organization do of supporting people making transitions into new roles, coming in from the outside or moving internally? And we're going to give you sort of 7-ish minutes or so to grapple with those questions. Enjoy. All right, my friends. So what I'd like to do is just get a couple of examples of particularly interesting or challenging transitions into new leadership roles. And we've got a couple folks with microphones here. So who wants to volunteer to, it could be like the ultimate victory transition. It could be the transition from hell. It really is up to you to tell us like what it's all about.
And I must add a quick comment. The Jutland people, they were a bit slow with comments and questions. I'm sure that the people of Copenhagen were going to prove that we're the better of them, right? We're the extroverts.
I really hope so.
Okay.
Any good examples? There's this one.
We have one over here.
Yep.
Mary from UNICEF.
I'm not sure it's a good example, but 2 years ago, I was transitioning from an expert role to leading experts.
Yep.
And who are my peers before, so it's a promotion, so leading people who are my peers. And I was telling my group here that experts are the most difficult people to deal with because they know it all.
Yes.
And I was part of them, so I also knew it all before then.
Yes.
And coming into this role was quite challenging in the sense that it was difficult, first of all, for me to leave my expert role because I loved it. So it was really difficult for me to leave my expert role. And the second one was, it was also challenging for me not to micromanage because I knew.
Yes, exactly. So this is a great example, Mary. And there's a lot of different pieces to this. I mean, you got promoted. That's one part of it. You were leading former peers. Which means relationships need to change. It may have been, may not in your case, but often it's the case that other ones of them may have thought they should have got the job, yeah? So you've got disappointed competitors you're dealing with. And then there's the particulars of the situation, right? Moving from being an expert to leading experts is a very big shift, right? In part for exactly the reasons you're specifying, right? Often those experts don't really respect leadership. Right? What value do you add? You know, they may ask, yeah. And also, as you put it so clearly, right, your own identity and sense of competence is very much anchored in that specialist ability. And so the risk is that you'll continue to sort of operate like you're a super peer and not actually lead, right? So it's a wonderful example. Other examples? I'll just take one or two more, hopefully.
Hello, Vibeke. I've done 3 transitions in the last 5 years. And I thought I would bring one that worked very well, where I actually moved up. I was 18 years almost with one company, and then I moved to a new company. Big change from B2C to B2B, different products we were selling. I had a lot of support. So I had a manager who really wanted me there. I had the next door neighbor who knew everything, and I had people working with me, and it was very easy. Then I went on to my next job. Expecting it to be easy.
Same company or different company?
Different company,
okay.
New company. And there was actually no one around me who could help explain the culture. I obviously didn't know the business. It was still a big change. And that proved to be really, really challenging because I didn't understand the mistakes I made and I didn't understand the business, so I didn't know where I could impact. Yeah, so it took a long time.
So this is a wonderful, comparison, right? And what it shows in part is if you're coming into an organization and they're not good at doing onboarding, you're very dependent on whether or not your manager and other people around you are supporting you or not. And so in the first one, you had someone who was very supportive. They had, they were welcoming of you, and it was tremendously empowering. And in the second case, that wasn't there, right? And I think it's in that second case, I guarantee that organization in general probably does not do a very good job of bringing people into the, so it's then just luck, right? Do you get someone who helps you or not? And I guarantee you've all had managers who have been very supportive of you coming into a new role, and you've had others that were just kind of go, figure it out. So maybe we'll take one more there's one more example. And anyone done a international move, perhaps with a family, that was particularly challenging? Yeah.
I think I have that one. So I came from I'm Jeppe, I'm from Leo, by the way. I came from another company. I worked in Denmark in a local role and was transited to Chicago in a global role, which is much more strategic than a local role, which is more tactical.
Yep.
So I went to that company and was really not expected the day I came. There was absolutely no introduction of any kind. I managed to talk with my boss for approximately 2 hours. And this was the big mistake. In Denmark, I mean, if we are giving a task, we like to take 2 days and think about it. Instead of having a square, wet one, we potentially come back with a suggestion of a round green one or something like that.
Right.
Now, my boss was from Latin America. He came from Guatemala. And in Guatemala, if he says that one is blue, then you don't discuss that it's blue, right?
Yep.
So the first meeting we have in public, I said, well, I will respectfully disagree with something. And that actually followed me the next 3 years.
Yeah.
He hated me from day one, also because he was forced to take me because things went well in Denmark and I was, transferred into
such a good
position.
example.
So no introduction and a manager that was pretty much playing against me.
And multiple layers of cultural difference,
that too.
right? Did you bring a family with you?
Yes.
Okay. How did that go?
Much better.
Okay.
They did well.
Yeah. Thank you. So in situations like that, and again, what you're seeing here, which I think is part of the point, is layers of different types of transitions going on, right? First of all, you said, look, you moved from more of an operating role to kind of a strategic role, right? So, which is equivalent to saying you moved from a role where you had a fair amount of authority to one where it was all about influence, right? That was problem number one. Then you shifted, cultures, Denmark to the US. And oh, by the way, you had a boss who represented yet another culture, and that's a managerial culture where you follow orders, and the boss is God, and that's not true in Denmark, it seems. Yeah, I'm joking, but yeah. So there's a lot of different layers to this, right? And it sounds like it was probably a struggle. What you also noticed was early things that didn't go so well. It was hard to kind of move past them, right? Because that person, that leader, had formed an opinion of you and wasn't going to necessarily change their minds no matter what you did. So terrific. And I love hearing examples like this because you can just see how rich the subject is, right? How many different kinds of transitions go on and the complexity and the interest of doing it. I mean, just a quick check. Did anyone do a transition, international move, say, with a partner or families where it was a real struggle for the partner or families? Hands up. Anybody? Couple, yeah. When doing expat moves, one of the biggest predictors of success, and it seemed to work for you, is does the family do well, right? Because if the family doesn't do well, in general, it's very challenging for the leader to do well. So good. On the second question, how many of you, just a quick show of hands, how many of you feel like your organizations do a good job of supporting people making transitions into new roles? Hands up. Yeah. So this is not surprising, right? And we don't have time to get into the whys of that exactly, but I suspect it's around things like the culture, the sense that you sink or swim as a leader perhaps, or confusion over who's responsible, or variation. Some people get it, some people don't. But it's just such a huge missed opportunity, right? Because there's so much you can do to speed up everybody if you focus on it in the right ways. So good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the two books. The first of which, it's okay. The first of which is The First 90 Days. What was I doing when I wrote The First 90 Days? I was writing the book. I'm kidding. What I was trying to do with that book was come up with a standard set of principles and frameworks and ideas that you could apply in any transition. So, the example you just gave us, the examples Martin gave us, right? Regardless of what kind of role change you're going through, I wanted there to be a set of frameworks and tools that would help you, and principles, right? That would help you be successful. That's what I was trying to do when I wrote The First 90 Days. And the framework that we use today, it's a little bit different from what's in the book because just there's evolution of our understanding of transitions. We call the transition roadmap. And that's what you're seeing up here on the right-hand side. And again, you're going to get copies of these slides, so don't worry about that. But I'm just going to take you quickly through it and hopefully help you understand a little bit about what it's all about. But actually, before I do that, how many of you had heard about or read the book The First 90 Days before this? Hands up. Okay, good number. Great. So you look at that framework, and what does it do for you? Well, you start with the left-hand side. And the left-hand side is about figuring out what you're there to do and perhaps beginning to think about how you're going to go about doing it. And that starts with the piece about accelerating your learning. I sometimes, when I do longer programs, I get groups like yours to talk about how do you approach learning about a new organization when you take a new job. How do you approach learning about a new organization when you take a new job? And I suspect for most of you, that's it's an intuitive thing you do, right? You have a pattern, a routine, a way you approach doing it. Often when I ask that question, people kind of go, geez, I had never really thought about it, right? It's just something I do. Well, this piece of the framework and the book is about how do you be systematic about speeding up the learning process, starting with what most of you need to learn about. Technical issues, culture, politics being three big categories. Where are you going to get the best insight for investment of your time? How can you be somewhat systematic in generating, understanding? And so Per Bank yesterday, he gave a great example. I think, you mentioned it, Klaus, of he was very systematic coming in and doing those interviews, extracting out insight from them. I think this is partly because he's an engineer, right? And engineers tend to, I describe myself as a recovering engineer, right? So I was an engineer originally. But being systematic, right? Just about thinking through the learning process. And a little bit of being, applying the right technique can have a really big impact. Matching your strategy to the situation, and Martin, you kind of alluded to this language, right, framework. When I started doing work on transitions and research and writing on them, it became very clear that the way you take a new job depends a lot on the nature of the kind of change challenges you're facing in that job. And so I built up this little framework called the STARS model: startup, turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, sustaining success, with a view to saying, look, you're going to transition differently if you're coming into a turnaround than you would if you're coming into a realignment or a sustaining success situation. In a turnaround, there is, the case for change has been made. People may not know what to do, but they know something different has to happen. In a more successful organization, there may not be acknowledgement that change is necessary. And so you may be able to move much more quickly and decisively in a turnaround than you do in a realignment. If you're coming into a very successful organization, it can be a big win just to demonstrate that you understand what's made the organization successful and that you appreciate what it's accomplished. So beginning to think about how does the situation you're in influence the way you come into that new role. The reality, by the way, too, is often you've got a mix of these, right? It's not just a single one. There may be part of your responsibilities, in one, some in the other. And again, I'm going to keep coming back to you, Martin. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep picking on you, right? But using that as a language for talking about what are we up against here, right? I sometimes get teams to go through an exercise of, where do we think different parts of the organization are? And I get them to do it individually. And then we put it down and we say, well, why do you think it's in turnaround and you think it's in realignment, right? You think we're accelerating growth and you think we're sustaining success. And it's a very simple exercise to do. You can do it yourselves. Tremendously informative, often. And helping to kind of converge and get alignment around the sense of what the situation is that you're really up against. But it also, in transition, leads you to think about things like, how quickly am I moving? What's the right balance between learning and doing, right? Because you don't want to strike the wrong balance and generate resistance inadvertently. Then there's the process of gaining alignment. This means being clear or becoming clear about what you're fundamentally there to do, especially with regard to the people to whom you are reporting, right? Which may be more than one. This is a set of conversations that you need to have, some of which is completely obvious, right? What are expectations, timeframes, measures of success? But there's other pieces that are maybe a little less obvious, and that, for example, that second conversation, do you have alignment over the nature of the situation and the challenges you're facing? I've seen examples where a leader goes into a new role and their manager thinks it's a turnaround, but they get in there and it's not quite that bad and there's actually some pretty good people. And I've seen the opposite, where, the manager says, there's some challenges, you need to go in and do some work, and they get in and it's a complete disaster, right? And so getting convergence turns out to be really critical. And then there's that first conversation about how will you work with the person that you're reporting to most effectively. How many of you have reported to somebody who has a very different communication style than you do? Hands up. Yeah. And what happens if you don't figure that out fairly quickly, right? We had a wonderful example, Klaus, yesterday, right, of this, where there was a leader and he described how he'd been working for an introverted manager, right, who, really thought things through and gave fairly precise instructions, right, or guidance about what needed to happen. And he went to go work for an extroverted leader, visionary, who would be throwing out ideas all the time, and he would be operating as if they were orders, right, to do it. And it took him like a year, I think he said, to really figure out that the guy was just, throwing out ideas in the end. And so even something like introverts and extroverts is pretty interesting. My father was a very extroverted person, and he used to say, how do I know what I think until I hear what I say? Right? How do I know what I think until I hear what I say? This is an extroverted thinking style, right? Extroverts like to think things through by talking things through, by articulating. It's why, if you're an extroverted leader, you need to have good people with whom to talk things through. You also learn pretty quickly that you better be careful about what you say because people will start to mobilize, right? If you're an introvert, often it's much more of an internal process, of thinking things through. So this issue of conversation style or working style is really crucial. And so when we coach people, for example, we're having them have pretty explicit discussions about how best to work with the person they're managing. We're also getting them to tell their teams how the team can best work with them. I sometimes joke that every leader should come with a user's manual, right? The care and feeding of Martin as a leader, because it really can speed things up. What drives me crazy? What do I really like? How much detail do I want? Right? If something's going wrong, how big does it have to be before you wake me up in the middle of the night? It's pretty basic stuff. So that left-hand side is the accelerate your learning, the match strategy situation, the gain alignment, mostly is about figuring out what you need to do. The middle piece is about how you're going to begin to establish direction for yourself and the organization. This is something I find most leaders do a pretty good job with. And in part that's true because usually the business itself has systems that support it, right? Goal setting, budgeting, strategy, and so on. So it can happen pretty naturally. Although, sometimes you don't align nicely with those systems. How many of you have gone into a new role and been expected to, put forward a budget or a strategy or something else really critical before you really had any idea what was going on? Anyone had that experience? Isn't that so much fun? Yeah. I was coaching a pretty senior leader recently at J&J, moving from a commercial role to a global public health role, and she was expected to present the strategy 2 weeks after she arrived. And you can imagine what that 2 weeks felt like, right? It was 24/7, just trying to figure out what was going on. She fortunately had a good team, which helped a lot. The right-hand side of the framework is really, okay, how are you going to have an impact here? Because you're just one person. And so what are the ways through which you can leverage yourself, right? Force multiplication, if you want to get into military terminology, right? And that revolves around your team, early wins, and alliances. I talked to you a little bit earlier about building the team, and I said for most leaders, at least the ones I work with, you don't get to build your team, you get to inherit somebody else's team. And you then need to assess that team and reshape that team. You don't know those people, right? You've got to figure out whether they're the people you really need to move things forward. You've got to understand how much scope you have to make changes on the team and what the timing of that needs to be. I did some work recently with a group from Oman. And what I was told, which is, I think it was Oman or Qatar, it was one of the two, I'm sorry, forgive me for messing that up, but the main message they gave me was, we have no ability to change who's on our team. We have no ability to discipline people for poor performance, right? We basically get this group of people, and we have to do the best we can. So there's a big issue of culture here, too, in terms of how much scope you have to make changes on your team. There's also a lot of care that you need to take in doing this. It's a process I describe as repairing an airplane in mid-flight, because you've got to keep the business operating. You've got to keep the business running, even as you may be wanting to make changes on the team to position things for the future. And so it's a very delicate process often that you need to go through. This is the framework we use just for diagnosing team effectiveness. I just put it up here for you, right? High-performing people have the right people in the right roles. That's the starting point. As a new leader, you want to be assessing, do you have the right people in the right roles? It's people, but it's also roles, and you don't want to miss that opportunity. Powerful alignment, that goes beyond just having the same goals. It gets to, do we have a shared vision of where we're going to, a story we tell together, a sense of understanding of how we contribute, right, to the overall strategy. So alignment and powerful alignment are not the same things. Are we operating efficiently? That gets to things like, how are we organizing to do what we need to do as a team? Meeting cadences, agendas, right? Follow-up, systems. And finally, collaboration, right? Are we operating in an environment of psychological safety? Are we able to have the right conversations? Are we digging deeply into the crucial issues? And so, again, the value of this work, I think, in part, is in having these little frameworks that help you think about things like, what's the work I need to do with my team? And you can think about it now, right? Think about the teams you have right now today. Do you have the right people in the right roles? Are they aligned powerfully enough to go where they need to go together? Are you operating as efficiently as you could? Are you spending that time together, that critical time you have together as a team, doing the work that really needs to be done? And is there the kind of collaboration in the team that there needs to be, right? Is there sufficient openness, transparency, a sense of mutual trust and support, as an example? So that's the building the team piece. And then early wins, this is in part about how you create momentum, right? You've got to decide at some point relatively early on, what are some places you're going to focus some energy to try to begin to have an impact? And you can't spread yourself too thin, right? If you do, you're not going to generate the momentum. And then finally, there's this piece on creating alliances, and there's a little bit of history behind this one. Before I started working on transitions, I was actually a professor of negotiation and international diplomacy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And so I had a very deep experience in Bosnia, Somalia, North Korea, Gulf Wars, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I got to work with a lot of very accomplished diplomats and do studies and train people that did that. And so I took a lot of the thinking from that and brought it into this piece of the first 90 days, because it's not going to come as a surprise to you, but organizations are political. Is that a shock to anybody? Yeah. And the higher you go, the more political they get, right? And oh, by the way, when you get to the top, you've got to deal with an external environment that's often highly political with really critical stakeholders. And so understanding how to do stakeholder analysis, how to manage and navigate political environments, how to build alliances is a really critical part of being effective as a senior leader. As an example, right, understanding that relationships and alliances are not the same thing. You can have a great relationship with someone, but they're not an ally. You can have a terrible relationship with someone, but you can collaborate with them to get something done that you really care about. So agendas, alliances, right? Alignments are critical part of understanding how you're really going to have an impact in the organization. And then finally, there's this piece that's about managing yourself, and it was discussed a little bit, earlier. This is about navigating what's inevitably a pretty stressful time. And you're almost certainly going to go through an emotional cycle, right? You come in, you're excited. Wow, I got a new job. This is awesome, right? And then, you start to come up against the challenges, the difficulties, the frustrations. And it's not at all uncommon to go into the valley of despair for a little while before you get out the other side. So how do you position yourself to keep your equilibrium, manage your energy, get the right advice and counsel as you move through this pretty critical period of time? So that, in a nutshell, as we would say, is the first 90 days framework. And again, and you're all, probably many of you familiar with it already, but the benefit of it is this provides you with a structure for moving through virtually any transition that you're going to go through. There's no rocket science here. I tell people basically the first 90 days is distilled common sense. It's a lot of stuff you would do naturally anyway as good leaders, but it's packaged in a way that lets you pay attention to the things you really need to pay attention to. So the first 90 days. Then there's this book, which is described as the essential companion to the first 90 days. And I want to explain why it exists and what the benefit of it is. Having said that all transitions are the same, and you can apply the same ideas to any of them, I then said, well, wait a minute, that's not true. There's lots of different kinds of transitions, and we saw that in the context of the examples that you gave me. And the way you navigate them is really quite different depending on the type that you're going through. And so this book is a deeper dive into specific types of transitions: promotion, onboarding, moving from a position of authority to one where influence is critical, taking on a turnaround as opposed to a realignment, leading former peers, Mary. So there's chapters in the book that basically you can kind of dip into depending on what the specific challenges you're facing or the person you're hiring is facing or whatever. So to help illustrate this, we're going to do a couple of case study discussions. And so in this beautiful red, not green, red, right? And red for very good reasons, I should tell you. I'm kidding. You're going to find a page that has a case study on the front and a case study on the back. The case study on the front should be labeled Daniel Erickson, at least I hope it is. And if you could just take a couple minutes to read that case. I was trained to be a case method teacher at Harvard. And you should know that for case method teachers, these are mercifully short cases, okay? It's one page, that's all you need to read. So having read the page, what I'd like you to do is spend some time at your tables talking through those 4 questions. Start with the situation, right? What makes the situation challenging? Why is he struggling? What does he need to be doing here? And then what, if anything, should the organization have been doing to help support him? And I'm just going to wander around. If you have a question, just put a hand up, and I'm happy to come by and try to help. All right? So, reactions to the case.
We have a couple of comments from these 2 tables.
Great.
Lars?
Yes, Klaus volunteered me to speak first. I'm Lars. I've been, I'm from Metro Service. We discussed that this is a clear example of a new manager coming in, having spent a lot of years in one organization where he knows the culture, where the culture is very mature, comes into a new company with a completely different culture. And as any anthropologist will tell us, that culture will trump an organization anytime, right?
Absolutely.
So he falls victim to this culture. And it's very, very difficult to succeed in a situation like this where, regardless of... So basically, he should have had a two-step strategy to figure out how the culture works, figure out how to work with the culture, and then...
Absolutely.
But it's easy to see afterwards.
Yeah, it is. But no, so thank you. And that's a really great observation. And culture obviously is really at the center of this case, as it is for most situations where you're joining a new organization. I'll show you some data on this in a minute, but the most common reason why people fail when joining new organizations is not understanding and fitting into the culture. And for this particular individual, these are real cases, right? This individual was fired about 4 months after this case was given because too much damage had been done in this case, right? But a big piece of it was he'd come out of General Electric, right, with a very strong, very particular culture into this kind of family, tribal, relationship-oriented situation and hadn't really taken the time to figure out how things worked. Anyone here work for GE? Can I slander a great organization with impunity? Yeah? So I have little jokes about this, right? And my joke about GE is you should always hire people on their second job after GE, because then someone has sanded the corners off them, right, a little, right? Because it's just a very strong culture, right? And so the example you gave us, which was wonderful, right, of coming in and just kind of putting it on the table, that's GE's very much like that, right? You do well in that culture. The one he came into, right, just not the way it worked, right? Those sorts of conversations didn't happen around the leadership table. They happened in the conversations before the conversations and the conversations after the conversations. And I like to joke, I mean, how many of you have gone to a meeting and realized that the real meeting has already happened, right? Yeah, this is culture, yeah? So good, other reactions? I think there was, Klaus, you volunteered somebody else, right?
Yeah. Melanie, you actually had another point about not the hire, but the person who hired, the CEO.
Yeah, we were talking about the alignment of expectation in general, and that is both alignment in regards to Daniel being hired into the company, expectation, again, around culture, but also as much about expectations out in the organization. So the person coming in is welcomed, and that the team knows why he's there. So basically, it's a matter of the proper transition,
Yes.
and proper introduction on what is actually his reason for being. And then, just a side note, he also should have taken consideration to get to know his team.
Absolutely.
Because he was not aware of the informal hierarchy that was in the company.
No, so both good points, right? So the CEO did not do a good job of setting him up for success, right? And in fact, the whole situation was really not a very good one, because this was a company that was at, it's a tired phrase sometimes, but an inflection point of moving from being a startup to starting to try to accelerate growth. And so there was real work to be done here to start to put in place the structures and systems to support growth. The organization did need to become more systematic, but the CEO's theory of how to do that was organ transplant, right? We need a kidney, right? That kidney's systems, and we're going to go out and find a kidney, and we're going to sew it into the body, right? And hope that that's what does it. In reality, what was needed here was a transformation of the company, right? Which, by the way, may have included the CEO figuring out that he wasn't the right person to lead the organization into the future. So it was a very bad setup. But then to your second point, he made it worse by not really focusing on building those alliances, understanding what he's there to do. But if you think about it, he was the wrong person for the job, right? If you define this as a transformation, right, a setting up of the foundation for success, you wouldn't have brought in Daniel. You would have brought in someone much more experienced than that. The problem with doing that, of course, is that person very quickly begins to look like what? The next CEO of the company. Yeah? And that's part of the real story of what happened here. Yeah? So it's an interesting one. So good. So I just wanted to focus a little bit of attention on the specific challenges of onboarding. And so, one thing I created fairly early on when I did this work was a list of common mistakes that people make when taking new jobs. I think Daniel made virtually all of them, starting with that first one, right, which is sticking with what you know how to do. All right, that saying from Mark Twain, I like a great deal, to a person with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. At this point in your careers, you have pretty big hammers. There's a risk that you come into a new role and all you see is a whole world of nails, right, to be pounded. When in reality, there may be different skill sets that are required, different capabilities that are required. Coming in with the answer. I say to people I coach who are onboarding, the words that should never come out of your mouth are, when I was at we, right? When I was at we, because nobody cares. And even worse, it may actively be irritating to hear that when you were at Medtronic, I'm making this up, and now you're at Stryker, that it's not a good thing. It's fine to say, I've had some experience with, or have you thought about this? But you see people referring to their previous companies, and it's not a good thing. Trying to do too much, setting unrealistic expectations. The action imperative, what that means basically is you can feel a lot of pressure to do things early. I'm working with a very senior leader right now who's very much in danger of falling into this one because he's been hired from the outside and he feels like he has to have an impact. So he's moving too fast, right? He's not taking the time, and it's not a crisis situation that would justify this. Neglecting peer relationships, right? Not building those lateral relationships early enough. So that's a key set of pieces to this. Then, as I mentioned, and it's not going to come as a surprise to you, the biggest reason why people fail when onboarding is around culture and politics. It's nothing to do with their, basic competence as leaders. And in this particular case, you very much see this operating, right? He didn't adjust to the culture. He didn't build the relationships. And, again, my point here is focus on a specific type of transition like onboarding. It has a logic to it. And in this case, the logic is that you need to figure out early the culture, the social system. You mentioned anthropology. It's a good way to be thinking about what you need to do. Yeah? So great. Again, little metaphors, right? So I do a lot of work with health science companies. I mentioned Johnson & Johnson, right? And so I developed this little metaphor of the organization, the culture being the organization's immune system, right? And if you do the wrong things, you trigger an immunological attack, right? Antibodies are secreted. Killer T cells begin to clump around you. And you are ultimately either digested or expelled from the organism. Yeah? It has a very biological process to it. Organ transplant's a variation on that metaphor, right? And so being sure that you're not doing things that trigger the immune system attack. And there's examples, right? A classic one is overestimating your mandate to make change. They've hired you from the outside. They've told you they want change. And you come in and you start making changes. It's like, wait a minute, you're changing things. But you said I was a change agent. Well, we didn't really mean it, But there's more subtle forms of this, right? So I say onboarding is hard in part because recruiting is like romance and employment is like marriage, right? During the recruiting process, we are falling in love. I have my best suit on. You look wonderful. I'll always do the dishes. I really like your mother. Seriously. Yeah? And then there's the cold, harsh light of cohabitation. Yeah? So just thinking about, and again, it's the logic of onboarding, right? Of understanding how to come into a culture successfully, build those relationships, navigate the politics of the organization. So good. I'm not going to dive into this in detail. There's plenty in the chapter in the first 90 days that deals with this, and also in the chapter in Master Your Next Move. But there's a logic to cultures, right? There's ways of thinking about how to diagnose cultures and speed up the process of understanding what you need to do in the context of a culture. You'll see the top level here it says symbols and language. How many of you work for an organization that has a lot of acronyms? Right. And if you don't understand what those acronyms mean, can you have any idea of what's happening? No, right? That's the language of the organization. I sometimes think organizations should issue a list of acronyms to every new hire, right? Here's your lexicon, yeah? And at the bottom, you see fundamental assumptions and values, which take a little while to figure out typically. But the real action is in the middle around those behavioral norms. What happens at meetings or doesn't happen at meetings? How does influence work in the organization? What sort of behaviors get rewarded and why? That's the inquiry that you need to engage in, that Daniel needed to engage in, if he'd been able to be successful in getting into the new organization. So good. Side point, I'm not going to dwell on this. Very few organizations do a good job of onboarding people. They often say they're good at it, right? But when they say they're good at onboarding, they typically mean this. This is, again, a study we did with Egon Zender, senior HR execs. They say, oh yeah, we've got an onboarding system, we're good at onboarding, right? It means you're good at giving people badges, access, computers, offices, telling them where the restrooms are, maybe orienting them to the business to some degree, making sure the legalities and compliance training happen. But the work of really integrating people into the organization, far fewer organizations do a good job of that, right? And one of the resources you'll get is an HBR article I co-authored with a couple of partners at Egon Zender called Onboarding Isn't Enough, right? That talks about the difference between onboarding and integration. And I would be very surprised if a lot of your organizations are really good at integrating people into the system. So good. So I think we'll be careful a little bit of the time, but I do want you to read that second case study. Yeah, we'll just do a little bit of time if that's okay. Just to illustrate the counterpoint, right, of another kind of situation. This is another real case, and this is actually someone I worked with taking a new role. Just take a couple minutes to read it. I'm not going to get you to talk about it at your tables. I'll just debrief you directly out of it rather than have you do that. But just a couple minutes to absorb the case and think about what it means. Alrighty, so as I said, in the interest of time, I'm not going to try and do a debrief of this one, but I would stress and hope you recognize that this is a very different situation than the previous one, right? This is someone who knows the organization, is a known commodity, right? The challenges here are very different. And it can be easy to think that internal moves are a lot easier than coming in from the outside. But it really is not the case, right? It really depends on the nature of the move you're making. And this one is a good example of a very challenging internal move, right? If you think about it, she's been promoted. She's moved to a different part of the organization, a different business unit, which is kind of like onboarding into an entirely new company in some senses. And she's done a variation, Mary, on kind of expert to leader, right? Only in this case, she's come out of this functional role, right, where she's been very deeply engaged in understanding how marketing works, right, and being very successful, and now she's managing a complete enterprise. And also, she's coming out of a series of situations that look more like accelerated growth into something that is more like sustaining success. And she's struggling. She was struggling in the real situation. Also, and I know you know this, but as you go to very senior levels, enterprise levels, responsibility for managing the external environment becomes ever more important, right? But that external stakeholder management piece occupies more and more of your time, and she hadn't really had enough experience doing that. And so this one is much more about making a particular set of shifts to move yourself from being a functional leader to being a true enterprise leader. And another one of the articles that I'm going to send you, an HBR article I wrote called How Managers Become Leaders, looks at the major shifts that you need to go through as you move to the enterprise level in organizations. Again, there's a chapter in Master Your Next Move about this that deals with this too, with promotion more generally. But if you think about what she needed to do to be successful here, she needed to move from being a specialist to a generalist. Mary, to your point, all that stuff around identity and sense of competence kind of goes away, right? The basis of your leadership changes. You've now got to integrate, which is the second big piece. You've got to build a senior leadership team and integrate across it. You've got to become more strategic. You've got to become more transformational. That's the bricklayered architect. You're the one that's got to set direction for the organization as a whole because nobody else is going to do it in the end. You've got to be the one that becomes more of a diplomat and really manages that external environment, that internal politics, and so on. And finally, you're the one that the spotlight is on, right? You're at the center of the stage. You have much less time when you're not being observed and judged, or through which you're sending important signals about the right kinds of behavior in the organization. So again, I can only sort of kind of introduce these things to think about, but what I want you to get from this is how different types of transitions can lead to very different demands, right? You can apply the same principles, but the way you apply them is very different because the nature of the transition challenges you're facing is very different. And that's what this book, Master Your Next Move, really helps you think about. There's a chapter on promotion. There's a chapter on onboarding. There's a chapter on moving from being a peer to being a boss, right? There's a chapter on going from a position of authority to one where you need to be operating very much across the organization, and so on. There are chapters about the difference between leading in a turnaround situation versus leading in a realignment situation versus leading in a situation where you have a complex mix of all of them going on. And so that's the sense in which Master Your Next Move is the complement, right, to the first 90 days. So that's it. I think I'll wrap up at this point. As I mentioned earlier, the work we do today largely is about helping leaders be successful, but also about helping organizations help their leaders be successful.